I didn't cry when the judge read the verdict. I didn't cry when my sister smiled from across the courtroom. I did one thing and one thing only. I started counting. 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. That was my sentence. And every single day of it I spent building something they couldn't see, couldn't touch, and couldn't take from me. By the time I walked out those gates, it was already over for them. They just didn't know it yet. My name is Serena Calloway. I was 28 years old when my family decided I was the most convenient person to blame. I was 31 when the truth finally caught up with all of them. But let me start where it actually begins. Not in a courtroom, not in a prison cell. It starts in a kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, on a Sunday morning when I was 9 years old, watching my mother make my sister's favorite breakfast for the 4th time that week. I remember standing in the doorway in my socks, waiting to be noticed. My mother hummed while she flipped the pancakes. My sister Diane sat at the table painting her nails, already bored with the morning that hadn't fully started. "Mom, I wanted to ask about the science fair." "Not now, Serena. Can't you see I'm doing something?" Diane didn't look up from her nails, but she smiled. "Just a little. Just 2 tables away from my office." My heart stopped. My heart stopped. The rules of our family. Not the last. I put myself through college. That part matters because my parents didn't, not really. My sister got her tuition paid without question. I got a job at a coffee shop at 17 and applied for every scholarship I could find. I studied finance at Ohio State, graduated early, and took a job at a mid-size real estate development firm in Charlotte called Mercer & Lane. I was 23. I didn't know anyone there. I didn't have connections. I just had work ethic and a very specific anger I'd learned to turn into fuel. Within 4 years, I had moved from analyst to director of acquisitions. My boss, a man named Gerald Mercer, was nearing retirement. He told me directly on more than one occasion that he planned to recommend me for a leadership role when he stepped back. That was also around the time I made the worst decision of my life. I told my family. My father called it impressive. My mother asked if Diane could have a job there too. Diane was 33 at the time. She had a degree in art history, a failed interior design business, and a husband named Patrick who thought networking meant buying expensive dinners on someone else's account. She had never worked in real estate a single day in her life. I said yes. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't just family pressure, though there was plenty of that. It was something smaller and more embarrassing. I wanted them to finally see me as someone worth respecting. I thought if Diane worked beside me, if she saw what I'd built, something might shift. Instead, I handed her the shovel she'd used to bury me. Diane started at Mercer & Lane as a client relations coordinator. It was a role I'd shaped to be manageable for her. Mostly hospitality, event coordination, keeping major clients happy at dinners and property tours. She was charming when she wanted to be. Clients liked her. Patrick started coming around the office more than made sense for someone with no role there. I noticed things, small things first, a client folder that had been moved, an email thread I hadn't been copied on, Patrick having lunch with one of our senior contractors without telling anyone. I told myself I was being paranoid. Diane was my sister. Patrick was just a glad-hander who liked to feel important. I stopped telling myself that the day I found the numbers. We had a mixed-use development project outside of Raleigh, 12 acres, residential and commercial combined, 4 years in the making. It was the most significant project in our pipeline. I was overseeing construction contracts. A routine review flagged a discrepancy I couldn't explain. $340,000 in materials costs had been rerouted through a vendor I didn't recognize. A vendor called Calloway Vance LLC. Calloway, my family name. Vance was Patrick's mother's maiden name. My hands didn't shake when I found it. I want you to understand that. Something went very quiet inside me. Not cold, quiet. Like a room where someone has just turned off a television that's been running for years. I didn't go to HR. I didn't call my sister. I made copies of everything, took them home, and locked them in a fireproof box under my bed. I wasn't sure yet what they'd done with the money. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that they'd already started planning what to do about me. 3 weeks later, Gerald Mercer called me into his office. His face was different, careful, like someone who had been told what expression to wear. HR was there. Two people I'd never met. A woman from legal who wouldn't look at me directly. The allegation was that I had approved falsified inspection reports on the Raleigh project, that I had signed off on structural assessments that weren't completed, that a portion of the building's foundation had been poured without proper review, and that I had known. I had not known. I had not signed anything of the sort, but my signature was on the documents, or something that looked very much like it. I said clearly and calmly that the signatures were not mine, that I had documentation of the vendor discrepancy that pointed directly elsewhere. They told me those concerns would be investigated separately. I was placed on leave effective immediately. I went home. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 40 minutes. Then I called a lawyer. She was a woman named Patricia O.C., a former prosecutor who had gone into private practice. She was direct, thorough, and expensive. She told me that what I described sounded like a sophisticated internal fraud paired with deliberate evidence manipulation. She also told me that without a clear chain of evidence tying someone else to the falsified documents, I was in a difficult position. Do you have any reason to believe your family members were involved? I told her about Callaway Vance LLC, about the $340,000, about Patrick's lunch with the contractor. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Keep the copies safe. Say nothing to anyone in your family. Document every communication." I followed every instruction. It wasn't enough to stop what happened next. 4 months after I was placed on leave, the Raleigh project site had a partial structural failure. A section of the parking foundation in the commercial wing buckled during final inspections. No one was inside. It happened on a Sunday morning, but it triggered a full investigation by the city's building authority. 3 days later, I was arrested. The charge was criminal negligence leading to property endangerment, with a secondary charge of falsifying regulatory documents. A Class C felony under North Carolina statute. My attorney filed immediately to challenge the signature evidence. We requested independent forensic analysis. The court-appointed forensic examiner was backlogged. The analysis would take months. My attorney wasn't able to delay the trial long enough. I went to trial 8 months after my arrest. Patricia was good. She was very good. But the documents looked convincing, and the prosecution had a cooperating witness, a mid-level site manager named Curtis Boyle, who testified that I had told him personally to move forward without waiting for the full inspection sign-off. Curtis Boyle had been hired 18 months earlier. His reference had been provided by Patrick. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They came back with a guilty verdict on the primary charge. I was sentenced to 3 years. My parents sat on the prosecution's side of the gallery, not because they were called as witnesses, because they chose to. Diane cried. I have thought about those tears many times since. I still cannot decide whether she was performing or whether some part of her, the part that had once been my sister, was genuinely grieving what she had done. Either way, she dried her eyes and walked out with my parents and her husband, and I was taken out a different door. My first month inside was about survival, not physical. The facility wasn't violent, and I kept to myself with the discipline I'd spent a lifetime building: emotional survival, learning to exist in a space where nothing I had built mattered, where my entire exterior life had been stripped down to a number on a wristband. I refused visits. My parents tried twice in the first 6 weeks. I sent word through the front desk, no. I want to explain that decision because I think it matters. It wasn't rage. It wasn't punishment. It was clarity. Every hour I spent in a visitation room with people who had watched me be convicted for something they knew I didn't do was an hour I was choosing grief over preparation. I couldn't afford grief. I had work to do. I wrote letters, dozens of them, carefully constructed, to Patricia. Every detail I could remember. Every name, every date, every inconsistency. I had access to a small prison library with a computer terminal for limited legal research. I used every minute of that access. I built a chronological document in my head, rehearsed it, revised it, added to it constantly. I also wrote one letter to my younger cousin, Marcus. He was 26. had a job in financial compliance, and was the only member of my extended family who had ever treated me like a full person. I hadn't been close to him in years. But I trusted him. I laid out the structure of what I believed had happened. Not everything, just enough. And I asked him to do one thing: watch Callaway Vance LLC, find out if it was still active, find out where the money moved. He wrote back within 3 weeks. The LLC had been dissolved 4 months after my arrest, but before it dissolved, it had transferred its remaining assets, approximately $410,000, to a holding account belonging to a company called DVP Holdings. DVP Holdings was registered to a Patrick Vance. I read that letter so many times the paper went soft at the folds. I am going to tell you something now that I did not fully understand until I was deep inside those 3 years. Anger, real, focused anger, is not a fire. It doesn't burn and consume. When you learn to manage it, it becomes structural. It becomes the frame of everything you do. I woke up every morning and I laid my anger down like a foundation, and I built my day on top of it. I didn't let myself fantasize about confrontations. I didn't imagine screaming at my parents or watching my sister fall apart in front of me. I thought about documents, evidence chains, forensic accounting, the specific names of the people who would eventually care about what I knew. Patricia filed a motion for post-conviction forensic review 14 months into my sentence. The independent handwriting and digital forensics analysis she finally obtained was unambiguous. The documents bearing my signature had been created using a digital forgery technique, superimposing a scanned copy of my real signature onto falsified templates. The metadata on the original files pointed to a device registered to the Mercer and Lane network, but accessed through an external login at a time when I had not been in the office. The IP address of that external login traced back to a service provider in the zip code where Patrick and Diane lived. The motion was granted. A new evidentiary hearing was scheduled. I was not released for that hearing. The legal process moved at its own pace, indifferent to what it cost me in time. But Patricia told me clearly, we had them. I told her to wait. I told her there was one more piece. Marcus had kept going, the way I'd asked. What he found over those months was methodical and damning. Patrick and Diane had used the Rally Project discrepancy as a template, but it wasn't their only instance. A smaller project the prior year had a similar vendor irregularity that had been closed without a full audit because the project had been completed under budget overall. The savings had gone to a now-defunct consulting firm whose principals were Patrick and a college friend of Diane's. The total diverted across both projects just under $600,000. When I had that number confirmed, when Marcus sent me a summary with documentation he had obtained through public records and the assistance of a financial attorney Patricia had referred him to, I allowed myself one night of something that wasn't anger. I don't have a clean word for it. It wasn't happiness. It was the feeling of a door that has been locked for years, finally swinging open on its own because the frame has given way. The next morning I wrote to Patricia, now. I walked out of that facility on a Tuesday morning in October. The air was sharp and cold and smelled like cut grass from somewhere nearby. I had a paper bag with my personal belongings, a phone that needed charging, and a change of clothes Marcus had brought and left at the front office the night before. He was waiting in the parking lot. He didn't say anything when I came through the door. He just handed me a coffee. We sat in his car for 10 minutes without speaking. Then he said, Patricia called. The DA's office received the full file at 8 this morning. I nodded. She said to tell you it was clean. Everything's in order. I drank my coffee and looked out the window at the flat gray sky. Did Diane know you were getting out today? He asked. She knew. Did she reach out? She sent a text. What did it say? I didn't answer that. Some things I'm still not ready to share. What I will say is that the text contained no apology. It contained an explanation. A long, careful, self-serving explanation for decisions that were made years ago, framed in a language designed to distribute the guilt so thin it would disappear. I did not respond to it. The DA's office moved quickly once they had the file. They had been, it turned out, building their own parallel investigation for the past several months. The forensic accounting firm Marcus had worked with had submitted a separate report to the State Financial Crimes Unit. The IP address evidence combined with the financial records combined with Curtis Boyle, who, when presented with the full scope of what Patrick had orchestrated and the possibility of his own extended sentence, agreed to revise his testimony, made the case straightforward. Patrick was arrested on a Thursday. Diane was arrested on the following Monday. The charges against her were lighter. She claimed limited knowledge of the technical forgery, but she was named in the financial fraud counts. Her attorney negotiated quickly. She cooperated in exchange for a reduced sentence. My parents called me the night of Diane's arrest. My mother called 3 times before I picked up. She said, "Serena, you have to understand, we didn't know the full. I know what you knew," I said. "And I know what you chose to believe instead." There was a long silence. "We're your family," she said. "I know that too," I said. "That's what makes it what it is." I hung up. The post-conviction relief process took 4 more months. Patricia had filed immediately following the new evidence hearing, and the court's response, while not fast, was decisive. My conviction was vacated on the grounds of prosecutorial error compounded by newly discovered evidence of third-party culpability. The judge who signed the order was not the same judge who had sentenced me. She read the findings into the record fully, with a clarity I had stopped expecting from any official process. I sat in that courtroom and I felt something release from behind my sternum, something I hadn't realized I'd been holding the entire time. Not anger. Not relief exactly. Something closer to completion. Patricia shook my hand on the courthouse steps. Marcus was there, a colleague from my early years at Mercer and Lane named Joanna, who had emailed me 3 months into my incarceration to say she believed me and had kept every scrap of documentation from our shared projects, was there too. My parents were not there. I want to tell you about compensation, because the people in the comments of my life, the ones who've known pieces of this story, always ask, yes, under North Carolina's Innocence Inquiry Commission provisions and subsequent civil action, I received compensation for wrongful incarceration. It was not enough to equal what I lost. Money rarely is. But it was acknowledgement in the only language the system speaks fluently, and it allowed me to clear the legal debt I had accumulated and to start over without being underwater. The civil suit against Patrick, Diane, and DVP Holdings is ongoing. I won't discuss the specifics. But I will say that Patrick's assets have been frozen pending trial, and the holding account Marcus identified has been fully seized. Mercer and Lane, the firm itself, settled a separate civil claim without admitting liability. Gerald Mercer called me personally before the settlement was finalized. He was 81 years old and not well, and his voice on the phone sounded like a man carrying something too heavy for his age. He said he was sorry, that they had moved too fast, that he had let the pressure of the structural failure override his judgment about who he knew me to be. I told him I accepted his apology. I meant it. He had not been malicious. He had been afraid, and he had made choices in his fear that cost me years of my life. Those are different things. I can hold both the harm and the absence of malice at the same time now. That took a long time to learn. I am 32 years old. I live in Charlotte. I work now as an independent consultant for development projects, smaller scale, carefully chosen, with contracts I write myself and review with an attorney I trust. I am not running anything with a family member's name in it. I am not interested in proving anything to anyone who hasn't already proven themselves to me. My relationship with my parents is, I'm not sure what word to use, existing. We speak occasionally. They have never said what I actually needed to hear from them, not in the way it would have needed to be said. My mother sent me a card on my birthday. My father called once to say he was proud of how I had handled everything, which is not the same as saying he was wrong for how he handled it. I don't go to Sunday dinners anymore. I don't think I will again. Diane is awaiting sentencing. I have not spoken to her since the courthouse steps on the day of Patrick's arraignment, when she looked at me across the lobby and started toward me, and I turned and walked the other direction. Not out of rage. I simply had nothing to say. I had said everything I needed to say in the documents Patricia filed. The truth was already on the record. I didn't need to narrate it to her face. There's something I've been asked many times since pieces of this became known. Do I regret giving her the job in the first place? I've thought about that carefully. The honest answer is no. Not in the way the question implies. I don't regret wanting my family to see me. That was a human thing to want. I regret nothing about the wanting. What I've learned, and I say this not as a lesson I'm handing to you, but as something I lived into slowly and painfully, is that there are people who will interpret your generosity as weakness and your loyalty as a leash. They are not always strangers. Sometimes they are the people who know exactly where to press because they've been watching you your whole life. The answer isn't to stop being generous. The answer is to stop being generous with people who have already shown you they will use it against you. There's a difference between an open hand and an unguarded back. I turned 32 last month. Marcus took me to dinner. Joanna came. 2 friends I'd made in the last year. People who know the current version of me better than they know the whole story. We sat at a corner table and I ate a good meal and nobody needed anything from me that I wasn't willing to give. That sounds like a small thing. It isn't. I spent so many years building something I thought would finally make my family look at me the way I needed to be looked at. I understand now that I was building for the wrong audience. The work was always real. The skill was always mine. What I needed to change was who I was trying to prove it to. I'm not angry at my sister. That surprises people when I say it. What I feel toward her is something quieter and harder to name. Something like the ache of a door that will stay closed not because of a fight, but because both people have gone too far in opposite directions to find their way back to the same room. Some losses don't end with a confrontation. They end with a Tuesday morning and a cup of coffee in a parking lot and the smell of cold October air, and someone who showed up for you handing you something warm without needing to say a word. I stood up from that car and I walked forward and I didn't look back. Not because I was performing strength, because there was genuinely nothing behind me worth turning around for. That's not a tragedy. That's finally knowing which direction you're supposed to be facing.